Drilling fluids touch just about everything in the drilling process. We're here to deconstruct the drilling process and drilling fluid concepts to provide a deeper understanding of our industry. In each episode, we'll share information, talk to interesting people, and maybe share a few stories along the way. Welcome to the Flowline, a production of AES Drilling Fluids, brought to you by Matt Offenbacher and Justin Gauthier.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Flowline. I'm here with Matt on Zoom. Matt's out in Midland. If you listened to the week before, he's not still out there, but we're recording multiple episodes because that's what we do. And then, it's funny because people do ask, like, how have you done this for so long, over so many weeks? How do you stay consistent? Well, that's part of it. If Matt travels or if I travel, sometimes we might have to get on Zoom and knock a few of these bad boys out. But the show always and must go on. We live to educate everybody, or at least Matt does. I live to ask dumb questions, and it somehow works out. And for today, there's a sort of a topic that's a little bit more, I guess, in the weeds. But again, I think it's important because it's a term that gets thrown around. And unless you understand it, you may not really understand why it's important. But when we talk about fluid compressibility, it's interesting. It's sort of a characteristic of fluid that ultimately can kind of change the way the fluid's behaving. And so, Matt, today we're going to talk about fluid compressibility. And you think you got the answers buttoned up? Because I got some questions for you.
Well, I hope so. It's one of those. This is one of those topics. I was actually on like a LinkedIn group, just trying to come up with a podcast idea. I'll be very honest. And a couple of people said, "Hey, what are the calculations for fluid compressibility?" And there was a little bit of dialogue, and I was like, that's probably not a bad thing to revisit, just because a barrel of fluid at surface isn't the same thing as a barrel of fluid downhole, and that matters in extreme environments. But sometimes we get questions about this, so. Yeah.
Cool. No, I think it's great. And, well, I'll bring this offline because I do have an idea. But with that being said, Matt, let's get into it. Under pressure, what is the fluid doing?
Well, under pressure, it wants to compress, but we have this, so it's going to shrink, right? Per unit volume. The higher pressure you apply, the less space it can occupy, right?
Right.
Heat it up and it wants to expand. Cool it again, it wants to shrink. So you got both a function of pressure and a function of temperature that affects the volume that fluid is going to occupy.
So for the folks listening, let's walk through that. So on surface, ambient pressure, whatever ambient temperature is, as the fluid goes downhole, what is the pressure and temperature doing?
It's going up. So imagine you have a really hot well. Let's say you're doing a high pressure, high temperature well, right? Well, you've got a lot of pressure, and so that's compressing the fluid, but you also have this opposite interaction where those molecules are bouncing against each other and like they want to expand. So, it's going to compress some, expand some, and it's sort of where we net out with that. And then guess what? As I circulate it back up to surface, those properties are going to change as it cools off. So, fluid behavior can be quite complex.
So, and you mentioned like high temp, high pressure, which is deep and hot and all the rest of it. But like say in shallow or like fairly benign environments, does that matter quite as much? I mean, I guess at what point? Oh, I've got someone waving. I think that's Mike Christensen. He was waving. He's mad FOMO, mad FOMO. Anyway, so like again, like at what? And I know it depends, but at what depth would you say this stuff starts to be important, or what part of the well?
I mean, I think that, so some of those dependencies, one is like, if you're drilling an unconventional well, we're not that hot. We don't have a lot of, some of the things that would affect us where if somebody says, "Hey, I need to know the fluid compressibility for application X," I may be able to just use sort of ambient conditions and get a pretty good idea. As we get into like really high pressures, let's say you're over 10,000 PSI, you're over 300, 350 degrees, Now you start looking at the way those fluids behave, and let's say you have a very narrow fracture gradient, or you have some other very like things you really need to narrow down to know what your density is because you have a risk of a well control issue. All of a sudden, this stuff starts to matter a lot more. So I think it's both the type of the well you're drilling and the conditions you're drilling with it. And so a lot of and I mean, let's get real complicated for you. How about a high pressure, high temperature well in deep water, where now you have fluid that gets cold and shrinks, gets hot and expands, but gets compressed because of pressure, and then comes back up the annulus, and we do it all over again.
Right.
So, you can see how this can be a fairly dynamic situation, and in a deep water well like that too, you may have a very narrow fracture gradient, where if you don't know your actual density, you could be go on losses, you could create other problems. So, you know, a lot of the unconventional well stuff, it doesn't matter as much, and we can use some ambient calculations to have a pretty good idea. When it gets hotter and hotter and, higher temperature, higher pressure, um, we have to start thinking about this in a little more detail.
Gotcha. So what about, I mean, are there other considerations that we need to be aware of? Any corrections, like anything to compensate for this sort of uh, what's going on?
Well, I think this is where your retort data comes in, pretty important, right? Which we sort of knock the retort for, being this rudimentary instrument, but you're going to like, let's say you got oil-based mud, you're going to want to know the amount of solids you have in there. They're a certain compressibility, which isn't very much. But then the brine actually has a certain compressibility, and then the oil has a different compressibility. So all three of those phases are going to have different properties, and you're going to want to be able to calculate what fraction of a barrel of mud um, is oil, is water, and brine, and is solids, and use that to calculate how that fluid's going to behave. And there's a lot of spreadsheets and other calculators out there that can help with that. It's going to vary by base oil even. Some base oils are more compressible than others. So,
Gotcha. What about on the brine side of things?
brine is kind of interesting because brines, this was one we would have, way back in the day, someone would say, hey, I need to know about compressibility because there's a thing called the pressure crystallization temperature, where basically you compress the brine and not all the salt can stay in solution because you've got less volume. Well, the interesting thing is brines like calcium chloride and calcium bromide are more compressible than sodium chloride and sodium bromide. So even whichever brine you're using may have a different compressibility that if you really start getting into the weeds here, you may want to know those values of how much the volume changes under pressure and relative to temperature. And you can get these curves that'll sort of help you figure out where you're at as far as those different phases.
Mm, okay. Makes sense. What about if we kind of bring it out of the field and into the lab? I mean, is there anything in the lab we can do to sort of help characterize what's going on or mod?
Yeah, I mean, this is where, so let's say I need to know my precise density, or I need to model these things, um, or confirm that I am where I think I am as far as downhole pressures. There's a thing called a PVT cell, and PVT is pressure, volume, temperature, which kind of makes sense, right? So you could keep a constant temperature and increase the pressure and get a curve. Then you could change the temperature and um, increase the pressure, and you basically get this matrix of curves where you can figure out, okay, at a certain pressure and a certain temperature, this is the volume this fluid occupies. And you can sort of interpolate and come up with sort of the math that will tell you what your fluid should look like downhole from a compressibility perspective.
Very cool.
And that's when you're getting really detailed. I think, a lot of times, I say most of the questions we get in unconventionals, or 90% of the calls I get, are how much pressure to bump the plug. And basically what we're trying to account for is when we're cementing and we pump that plug down, you need to apply a certain amount of pressure. And you know that under certain pressure, you're going to lose some volume. So when you're doing precision pumping, if I pump 3 extra barrels because my mud is losing volume, it's shrinking under compression, I want to know what I'm actually applying downhole with under those factors. But those are pretty straightforward spreadsheet calculations because you just need to be you know what neighborhood you need to be in basically. So, but occasionally we get those requests, and like I said, that's an easy spreadsheet one.
Got it. Okay. Now bringing it into the field, what are some things we can do out there to help?
Well, I think a pressurized mud balance, especially in if you have higher flow line temperatures and you're trying to take the density really quick, and of course recording the temperature that you have so you can correlate it to the model. This is another one when you talk about PVT. If you're drilling a really hot well and you run your retort off of the mud without letting it cool, you can actually end up getting some very strange results because that mud, when you put it in the retort cup, actually shrinks. It would shrink if it cooled, and any of that void space counts as solids, right? So if you run a mud and a retort that you took from a very hot flow line versus a cold flow line, even if they had the same amount of solids, the hot flow line one would, if you didn't let it cool, would show more solids. So making sure that you're consistent on those things can be pretty important. And then, look, if we're drilling a really high spec well, we got to be super fancy because we got to be super detailed. You can correlate what downhole pressures are with your PWD tool, which we've talked about in the past. There's a lot of sensors that you can sort of calibrate to any of these models and say, everything makes sense based upon what we've done relative to what we know. And so I think that sort of takes out some of the complexity because you can do direct measurements and check yourself.
Got it. Well, man, that's about all the questions I can think of, Matt. And I'm covering it well. Obviously, it's what I do enjoy about having these conversations with you is being able to go from the field into the lab and talk on both sides because depending on the audience, and again, appreciate all the support and the listeners over the years, but I think it's a lot of them come from either one side or the other. So to bridge the gap, I think is just part of the secret sauce. And so I find I learn something every episode, and hopefully the listeners do too. With that said, Matt, if unless you got any closing last words, we'll wrap this bad boy up.
I will just close and say that I get to learn a lot by putting this stuff together because I might vaguely know it, but you kind of have to do your homework and go take some more notes. And so it helps refresh some things in my head too. So
like mini research, it's like micro research projects weekly.
Well, hopefully it keeps me sharp. I wish I remembered more of it in the day to day, but it certainly keeps me on my toes. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, if any of the listeners out there have any good ideas for a show, please reach out and connect with us on LinkedIn. Also, I encourage you to connect with AES Fluids on LinkedIn. A lot of great content being put out. And if you're new to the show, I'd mentioned it before, but we've got the videos out now. So we're doing a video podcast and audio. So depending on what you like. With that being said, everyone, appreciate the support. And until next time, be safe out there. Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks for listening. Please tune in next week for another exciting episode of The Flowline. And remember, may your returns always be full and your trips always smooth. Views expressed in this program belong to participants and not their employees. The program is for informational purposes only and cannot take the place of seeking professional advice. Copyright AES Drilling Fluids.